This lesson is to serve as an introduction to the next reading that we're going to do in class, which is from the novel Hiroshima by John Hersey. This is a nonfiction account of the bombing of Hiroshima, Japan, towards the end of World War II. We're actually only going to read the first chapter of this novel, but before we even do that, I'd like to give you a little bit of background information, just in case you're unfamiliar with the bombing of Hiroshima. This took place in August of 1945, and we were at the end of World War II. If we look back a little bit a ways, we had been at war for 6 years at this point, and this was World War II, as I mentioned. By this point, Germany had already surrendered. They had surrendered in May, and we were left only fighting the Japanese, and Japan was refusing to give up the fight. Considering we had been at war for 6 years, and we needed the war to end, President Truman needed to make a tough decision. He had some new technology, some new weaponry available to him, specifically the atomic bomb. And so it was Truman's task to determine whether the American people would choose to drop the bomb on Japan. Excuse me. He did decide to do so, and on August 6th, 1945, it was approximately 8:15 in the morning, Japanese time, the atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, Japan. And then, 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, we dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, Japan. Over the course of those two bombs, more than 200,000 people died. Many died of the initial impact and blast. Others died from injuries caused by the blast, and still others died from the effects years later from that blast. After we dropped the bomb on both of these cities, there was the beginning of a shift in perspective. We should note that President Truman his plan was successful. Japan was forced to surrender. But as an American people, as a whole, we began to shift our mindset. We had initially believed that our fight in World War II was necessary and just. However, after the atomic bombs were dropped, we began to start to have anti-war sentiments filtering in to the American people. And there were several reasons for this kind of shift to an anti-war mentality. First of all, the technological advances in weaponry. With the advances in weaponry came the ability to kill more people faster. I mean, we've gone from a hand-to-hand combat situation in early wars. We've increased our weaponry ability to cannons and then to guns and to grenades. And we continue to make more and more advances that basically make it easier to kill larger numbers of people. And with the atomic bomb, we see a massive loss of life just with a single drop from an airplane. So these advances in weaponry and how quickly we're gaining the ability to kill mass numbers of people at a time really start to affect this shift to an anti-war sentiment. Also, the sheer magnitude of the global conflict. I mean, we've been engaged at this point, here at the end of the war, for 6 years in a war that covered multiple countries, several continents, and so just the sheer magnitude, it's no longer small skirmishes this begins to shape the anti-war feelings. And also our advances in communication. Prior to this, we would get news reports much, much later after the fact of the actual battle or the actual event. Now, however, here at the end of the 1940s, early 1950s, our ability to communicate has grown. And so now we can get reports on the progress of the war from any location around the world. And not only can we get them via print, which is important, but we can also get them via radio and film media, which means we have an audio and a visual component. We can see what's going on. And while reading about it is one thing, sometimes hearing it and seeing it gives it a whole other element. It makes it more real. And as it's made more real and people are seeing what's actually occurring and going on, not just kind of hearing about it second, third, fourth hand, as anti war sentiments continue to grow. The real anti war movement began in the early 1960s, but we did have some beginnings of that movement prior to the 1960s. And John Hersey's novel Hiroshima, which was published in 1946, is considered to be one of the early pieces of anti war literature. In his novel, he describes the devastation caused by the atomic bomb. Originally, it was not published as a novel, it was published as a four-part article in the New Yorker. And in this article, he chooses to focus on 6 recognizable, relatable survivors. It's important to note that the survivors that he chooses are not necessarily representative of the population of Hiroshima. Instead, they're meant to be recognizable for American readers. They're relatable to us because we can recognize them. So instead of some distant people in some distant city, now we are seeing 2 doctors. We're seeing 2 clergy members. We're seeing people that we can relate to because they're simply like people in our city that we live in. And with that relatability, that recognizability, we feel an extra level of sympathy and empathy to them. They're suddenly not so distanced, not so far away. His work is ranked among the early anti-war literature. Some specific literary elements and analysis that I'd like you to pay attention to as you read Hiroshima, the first chapter. So I want you to think about theme. Remember, theme is the central idea or insight in a work of literature. And theme is often implied, which means the author doesn't come right out and tell you what the insight is or what the idea is. Instead, the author chooses to reveal it indirectly, and he or she will use details, characters, events, descriptions, and literary devices. I want you also to pay attention to author's perspective. Author's perspective, remember, is the point of view from which he or she writes. And there's 2 different types of perspective. There's objective, which is when the narrator reports events without obvious emotion or bias. And then there's also subjective. The narrator expresses feelings about the events directly in his writing. The third thing I'd like you to look at with this piece is I'd like you to look at the political assumptions. The author's not going to come right out and tell you his political leanings, but look at the details in the text, and my guess is you will be able to find his political beliefs in there. As always, if you're struggling with the reading or you have any questions, you can always feel free to contact me.